Buon pomeriggio, good afternoon, everybody. This is Massimo Leone, so welcome to a new meeting of our seminar this year about the topic of depolarization in religion and ethics. And today we have a meeting about depolarization and the role of artificial intelligence with three distinguished speakers, Dr. Stefanie ULLMANN, Dr. Riccardo Gallotti, and Dr. Marco Guerini, whom I thank very much for accepting to take part in this dialogue. We'll start with a talk by Stefanie ULLMANN. Dr. Stefanie ULLMANN is a postdoctoral research associate on the project Giving Voice to Digital Democracies, the Social Impact of Artificial Intelligent Communications Technology, based at the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities, CRAS, at the University of Cambridge. She holds a PhD in linguistics from the University of Marburg in Germany, and her most recent work has focused on quarantining online hate speech, misinformation, gender bias in machine translation, dynamic data statements, and exploring counter-speech approaches to fighting harmful content. So, Stefanie, once again, thank you very much for accepting to join our conversation, and the floor is all yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Massimo, for inviting me, first of all. I will try and share my screen now.
Maybe give the floor to Riccardo. In the meantime, Stefanie will send me the presentation and we'll have a presentation shared. If Stefanie, that is okay with you?
Yes, that is okay. Sorry about this.
Okay, so Riccardo, go ahead. Thank you. Thank you, Riccardo, but let me present you and introduce you, because Riccardo Gallotti is an interdisciplinary physicist leading the ChuB lab at the Bruno Kessler Foundation in Trento, a research unit for the data-informed statistical modeling of individual and collective human behavior. His research interests range within complexity science and data science, focusing on human mobility, multimodal transportation, decision modeling, and online communication. Before joining the foundation, Riccardo was affiliated to the Institute for Interdisciplinary Physics and Complex Systems in Mallorca, the Center for Complex Systems and Brain Sciences in San Martin, Argentina, and the Institute for Theoretical Physics of the Atomic Energy Committee in Saclay, France. Riccardo, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Let me. I cannot share the screen as well because I have no screen recording permission on my computer or something. So, okay. Let me try to solve this quickly. I have to quit Google Chrome and reopen myself.
So apologies for technical problems. Okay, Marco is able to present.
Yeah, I just checked while I was there and it works. Mine it works.
Okay, Riccardo is back and with a presentation. Thank you.
Yes, you should see the screen now. No?
Yes, we see it. Thank you.
Perfect. So I can start. Perfect. Thank you all of you for the invitation. I'm here trying to squeeze into a talk a lot of topics because my title has been very daring: quantifying and modeling online polarization and the spreading of disinformation. So we have a quite like a long menu because I promised to explain a bit how we can model polarization, especially try to justify why physicists are in this field. And modeling the spreading, that is actually something that because of COVID, a lot of us have become familiar on how spreading behavior, spreading dynamics are modeled. And then how to quantify all this through data science and artificial intelligence. And this is basically one of the marks of what we are doing in DIGIS at FBK. And then try to close all of this, try to understand why this has become a major issue, this problem of polarization, disinformation in the modern communication environment, and possible countermeasures beside those who will be introduced by Marco afterwards. So in my unit, we don't work only on disinformation and polarization. Actually, I don't really work on polarization, but I focus also in human mobility, urban sustainability, and cooperative AI. But of course, here where we are at is mostly the focus on disinformation that in FBK we had in the last couple of years. First, I have to share one trouble I had, because I'm a physicist and I found myself very distant from the discourse of ethics and religion. And also, we have the problem as physicists that we apply a very simplifying attitude to other fields that sometimes has been found as obnoxious. I try not to be like this since I work as an interdisciplinary physicist since like 10 years, but sometimes this happens. I also share the legacy of physicists with long and crazy hair, as much as Marco shared the legacy of philosophers with long beard, but Marco cut the beard explicitly for this talk, so this joke works a bit less sharply. Anyhow, why physicists work on human behavior? Well, the word polarization at the core of this discussion is a word coined by physicists. It was coined to describe the light polarization, that is the phenomenon that is used, for instance, for a polarized lens that we use as sunglasses, or we use for watching TV and 3D cinema nowadays. Of course, this is not the kind of polarization we are treating here. We are mostly treating now political polarization, behavioral polarization. That means the fact that during the last years, from a political perspective, for instance, people has become more and more distant and isolated in their view. There are other forms of polarization in physics. One is, of course, magnetism. There are others like electric polarization, ionic polarization, space charge polarization, and something that is interesting here is orientation polarization. Because, yeah, orientation is a word that sounds also political, no? Indeed, a political orientation can be like authoritarian or libertarian or economic left against economic right. And actually, the model we use for describing magnetic polarization in a solid is based on two aspects. That is the interaction with an external field and the interaction among all the magnetic dipoles in a material. And the model we use for doing this is called the Ising model. And this same model is the model that we use in physics for describing social polarization. The base of the Ising model is the idea that people, or in this case, dipoles, you can see as people in a lattice, and can be also people in any social network. They have some neighbors, some people they know, and the people can be of similar or different view. And there is a cost of being sharing a friend with different, having a friend with different views, and of course there is a cost of being against what could be an external field. That could be, you know, if you are in a state where you're not, you don't have free speech, you have an advantage of following the leaders, for instance. But through this model, we see that we can study the evolution of the collective behavior as people switch between one belief to another because the neighbors, their friends, are following that beliefs. So in physics, we use the Ising model for describing the evolution of polarization, or in magnetism, but also in the society. And actually, this Ising model is very similar to the Schelling's model that is used for instance, studying segregation. In the Schelling model, is the something similar. You have people which are arranged in this, also in this case, in a society which is squares, and your friend is someone who is next to you in this lattice, and you are allowed to move away if people around you are of different color, of different opinion. And this makes, as you see in this GIF, which loops, an initial condition which is initially random, like this, become progressively segregated. The Schelling's model explain why you can have segregation in societies, because people move away from different thoughts, if you want. And these describe the two homophilic dynamics that tend to create echo chambers in modern societies. You have selection, you tend to be and try to have around you only friends that think exactly like you, and you have influence. So you are influencing, or you are influenced by the people that surround you. So with this, I try to explain why physicists are in this field, because we already had the mathematics and the models for describing some of the social phenomena we are observing nowadays. And I can try to show a bit how we try to model spreading. These are models we use in a recent paper published a few months ago, where we try to explain how there is coupling between infodemics and epidemics during COVID-19 pandemics. But the idea is that not only for the epidemic spreading, we use models like where there's someone who is infected that can infect someone who is sane or susceptible in this case, but also for thoughts, for ideas. Someone who never been influenced by an idea, or someone who never thought or something, or never received disinformation, can be treated like a susceptible individual that can be infected by someone who is sharing information with them. So we can use SIS-like model, so models where there is spreading of these being infected by epidemics or by infodemics. In some cases, we have SIR, means that people can recover from being infected by fake news or by some kind of belief, but is not necessary. And if you want to go a bit more in the detail of the mathematics of this kind of model, which is also very, very useful for understanding the mathematical effects of vaccination and herd immunity, I suggest you to check Complexity Explorables, which is a website where you can literally play with these models very easily. But I don't want to go into deep, because we are all experts in epidemiology after 2 years of COVID. And so we are, for describing information spreading, we use in our paper the model that is SIS, as I said, where there is a probability that someone that has some belief which are not reliable can in fact be someone who are actually thinking about reliable information. So someone who thinks that vaccinations are bad can convince someone who don't have strong opinions about vaccination, for instance. This model can be complicated a bit to be a bit more realistic, but the important is that these are simple models based on binary interactions that where someone can influence someone else based on also local interaction and eventually global interaction about what is the state of the epidemics all across the whole country. So this has been very quick. I don't expect you to have followed everything, but if in modeling spreading is a long problem, and this was a kind of quick idea that we can study that through the evolution with simulations of binary interactions between people who have not some certain belief and people who have it. And how we measure spreading? Actually, measure spreading somehow is easy thanks to the abundance of digital data on social media platform, which is available right now. And here I illustrate some results from another paper of ours, where we studied basically the retweet network across the discourse around COVID-19 worldwide. And this retweet network can be mapped like in this plot at the left, where a different color identify different communities they are discussing about this similar topics. These communities can be isolated using network science algorithms of community detection. And on the right, you can see the inflows and the flows between communities that are among the largest communities of this plot. So we can see that in tendency, there are communities, the communities tend to communicate more between themselves, but there is also a flow of information between one community and another. This was kind of normal. What is not normal is the fact that the role played by the major spreader inside of this community, very often there are the leaders of the community, so people who spread a lot of information, the more followed user, which are active trolls or are comedians or are people who are not set to be leading the information discussion around COVID-19, for instance. And this is dangerous if you let the random people become community leaders, especially trolls that on purpose try to sway the discussion against perhaps what is the common good. Also, as in general, we have that these kind of communities, only a little number of users are active communicating and sharing and interacting, while a lot of users are only passively receiving the communications. And polarization is even easier to check. This has been done since 20 years. This on the left is an example of the political polarization of blogs, American blogs, and red and blue represent the two major parties in the US. As in this spring-like visualization where nodes are close if they're strongly connected and far apart if they're loosely connected, you can see that most blogs which are right-wing are connected to other blogs that are also right-wing. So they are citing themselves only. You don't speak of what others do. And on the right is a more recent work where it's been measured how much of neighbors, so friends in Facebook or followers in Twitter, are of the same political leaning. And we can see that this actually depends on the type of the network, of social network, of social media platform. A platform like Twitter or Facebook, where the recommendation system is very strong, are highly polarized. Platform like Reddit and Gab, where there is not a strong recommendation system, this is less pronounced. And then I wanted to spend a bit more time on how to measure disinformation, because this is basically what we focus on in the last couple of years in FBK and in DIGIS. And we developed in the first months of the COVID pandemics what is the COVID-19 Observatory that you can access to the website indicated in the middle of the screen, where you can check every day what is the fraction of messages on Twitter that we can identify as disinformative. This has been supported economically and advised by WHO and capture every day over 4 million tweets. And we analyze them in quasi-real time, means that we have the results with 2 days of delay. And we analyze both the textual content and the communication network between users to identify international patterns of disinformation. And as I told you before, only a little fraction of people is actually active producer of content in Twitter. We call them consumers, no, creators, those who are active producer of content, and consumers are those who more passively are only receiving, sometimes retweeting content. And we also this is a fact that is all common in all internet platforms. There is a known rule that is the 89-10-1, means that 89% of users don't do nothing, 9% are basically producing content, 1% are dominating the system. And this is not something which is an inequality, is not bad by itself. What is bad is that if only a little vocal community are continuously informing a larger fraction of users about information which is misleading, and the consumers, so the people who are passive, have not information on the fact that the creators are only a few, and with respect to the totality, they can think that the majority of people think what the creators say. And in some echo chambers, this is what happens, and this is why we believe that this kind of behavior should be targeted, and when a community is dominated by a little fraction of people, we should somehow highlight the fact that the information and the belief is shared only by this little fraction. And about how the story of this the COVID-19 Pandemic Observatory, what happens is that in the early days of COVID, Manlio suggested me to wear the face mask while I was in Japan, because he thought there is this thing, this COVID, which is not really I trust, so it's better for you to wear a face mask. And I started also gathering tweets since the 22nd of January, that in Italy it was very early for being worried, let's say, about COVID, but he was right, unfortunately. And he also formed this team that focused for a couple of months on developing this platform. Our idea was to track in real time the spreading of this information on Twitter. And in the spreading, we have different types of actors. We can have human or bots, and can have actors that want to spread the reliable news, like the actors see on the bottom right, or actors who actually spread fake news, like A in the top. But the most importantly, there are actors in the middle that receive both fake and reliable information and cannot really discern between these two. This is what is called an infodemic. An infodemic is when there is so much information, and there is so much information that can be reliable and reliable, that you cannot easily discern between reliable and unreliable facts. And so to measure, we could measure this information in real time thanks to this data gathering, and we developed a pipeline that tried to extract all the information possible from every tweet. And we geolocalized the tweets. We passed through a fact-checking methodology that we'll explain shortly. And we tried to quantify the risk of being influenced, as I said before, by the disinformative news through this communication network. The fact-checking methodology is not based on AI yet. We really want to make an improvement on this. We try to submit a European project to have the funding for this improvement, but it's mostly based on different collections of websites and data sources coming from papers that identify some URLs as possibly disinformative. So what we are characterizing is not the textual content of the tweets, but is the domain of the URLs that are shared. So if it's a tweet which is shared by Fox News in the US, it is probably politically biased. If it's Russia Today, it could be fake news. If it's Il Lercio, is satire, something like this. And we built an interactive platform that allowed the public to be informed in real time about the fraction of this information. And we could also use the two quantities, like they are the infodemic risk index and the level of epidemic spreading, which was something that everybody was informed about for their country every day at the time of the peak of the pandemic, to try to make some science. This had a very huge scientific outreach. Let's say we were very happy with the outreach we had with our platform. And the question now can be, sorry for the questions. I know that you probably don't like a question, but this is very easy. We wanted to understand and have a singular measure on what is the risk of being influenced by disinformation. And this is relatively easy. It's just the fraction of disinformative tweets with respect to all the tweets around. We actually can do this only on a sub-fraction of tweets that we can identify, but and we use the exposure as a proxy. Polarized exposure, it means the number of followers that are can be reached by some user that publish some disinformation. So if a user that has a lot of followers publish disinformation, this can be influencing more than users that have a little number of followers. And this measure, the infodemic risk index, goes between 0 and 1. If it's 0, there is no disinformation around. If it's 1, all the tweets which are circulating are somehow to be checked and taken with a grain of salt. And these two plots on the bottom show the evolution for the first 2 months of COVID of disinformation in Italy and US. And we also can color with the two different shades of blue verified users, which are light blue, and dark blue is unverified users. And here we already see that disinformation, for instance, fell down in Italy when we start having the first cases in Codogno. And in the US, you had a higher level of disinformation, mostly dominated by verified users, and you can already think why this happened. And this is instead an animation that shows the evolution of the level of disinformation online. And if you watch Brazil, you see that Brazil is getting progressively darker. This is completely different from what happens in other countries. In other countries, we have that normally at the beginning, we have more disinformation than in the following months after the COVID arrived. And with this, with the data we had gathered, we could also go deeper and map the information on the state level in US or a regional level in Italy or in Europe. And we can also check other countries. We see that some countries like Canada has consistently low level of disinformation. South Korea has low level disinformation, but some days they have a higher level. So countries like Venezuela and Russia have higher level of disinformation, and Venezuela is one of the worst countries with respect to the information, disinformation around COVID across the globe. And good news, that is gathering all the data we collected through the first 2 months of COVID. We plot here in 3 different ways the fact that when we had the larger number of infected cases across the globe or across a single country or in a particular day, we had less disinformation spreading. So at the beginning of the epidemics, people were discussing about COVID without real checking information or properly players like news media that normally communicate reliable information were not carefully discussing about COVID. But when the thing got serious and we had local cases, progressively disinformation has been reduced across the globe. So with this good news, we went to WHO that financed us the second version of the platform, which is more bright color and more beautiful to check. And you can also you can see this new version in the website. So now that I hope that I showed you how we quantify disinformation, polarization, and spreading online, I want to close to try to basically discuss a bit why it's important, why we are here having this long meeting about polarization, disinformation. And of course, the problem is that thanks to the participatory nature of social media, it is possible to manipulate what people think. And this is way easier than what was possible before the use of the intensive use of social media. There are different. I suggest these two books. They are very short books on the topic, but they discuss on how building over existing beliefs, putting fire on these existing beliefs, adding disinformation and biased information, and only exciting information. They try to trigger phenomenon like polarization, harassment, hate, and cancel culture. And these done by professionals and by people who deliberately push disinformation and fake news around can literally sway the public discourse over important topics like COVID. And these arguably can even arrive to the normalization of extreme opinions that become so common that you cannot recognize anymore as extreme opinions. This happens through the different methods. One which works very well is clickbaiting. Not only the clickbaiting you think about ads or something, but in general it's been proven that fake news spread by people who are not necessarily biased, but they literally don't activate their reasoning for doing the click that says retweet, reshare. Probably you're all familiar with the model of fast and slow thinking of Kahneman. What happens is that fake news is built very often to trigger fast responses before a slow response could eventually discard the opportunity of sharing this fake news. And this is why the current online communication, also in the news media, is not anymore based on number or times or quantitative effects, but mostly on opinions and emotional effects. And one result by the same research scientist of the last paper is that is it sufficient to say to those users, it is important to think about the news and think if they are true or not. And this is sufficient to lower significantly the number of fake news circulating. And this fight against the role of the social media algorithms of Facebook, of Twitter, of any social media that, on the other hand, tries to activate your instinct to reshare, to retweet, to engage. So all algorithms, all social media are built to keep you online, keep you active. And for this, they are selecting in your feeds news or facts or posts that raise these performances by being more exciting. And this fights against what is actually needed for reducing the spread of disinformation, which is rationality. I suggest to all of you who didn't see it, the movie on Netflix, The Social Media, is a documentary about this problem of the algorithm in general. And indeed, there are some countermeasures that have been applied to reduce this information spreading. One has been trying, like in Twitter or in YouTube, if you see, to highlight reliable news sources like the Minister of Health of Italy about COVID, for instance. But as demonstrated by Rand and Pennycook, just say, hey, check, perhaps you want to read the news you're sharing. If you're clicking retweet about a news article that you didn't have the time to click, or you didn't read the article itself, sometimes Twitter suggests you that it's perhaps better if you read the article between sharing it. And also, it happened with in Twitter, this kind of automatic fact-checking snippets that said about Trump, that say, yeah, the information which is contained in this tweet might not be reliable. This, as you probably remember, activated a sort of fight between Twitter and Trump on the fact that Trump didn't like this snippet to happen. And you know how it ended, but also banning bad users is a possible solution, of course, for reducing the spread of disinformation. And I want to close with one interesting idea of for countering disinformation. That is the idea proposed by Facebook. Facebook doesn't want to be controlled by states. So what they say is that what we do goes beyond the law of every single state. We are creating our own oversight board. We create ruling about what we have to do. These are neutral experts that will decide what are the rules of Facebook for reducing pathological behavior like disinformation, and then we will act on what they say instead of following any particular state rule. This is, in my opinion, extremely dangerous, especially now that they are trying to push this metaverse concept, but is an interesting angle that Facebook has been taking. So now that I hope it's a bit more clear why disinformation and polarization have become a major issue, and I illustrate a few countermeasures that over which Mark will go probably much deeper. I can finish by going through what was today's menu. I try to illustrate you why myself as a physicist was at this meeting, and how our mathematical perspective can allow for modeling polarization, for modeling spreading, and how by means of data science and artificial intelligence we can try to quantify these quantities. And I give a very, very rapid overview on why these have become a major issue in the last years. So thank you very much for your attention. I don't know how long I've been, but I hope I was on time.
No, that was perfect in terms of timing as well. Thank you very much, Riccardo. And I wonder whether we could have a discussion at the end, because the three papers are extremely interconnected. So I guess we can now give the floor to Stephanie. Stephanie, maybe you can try to share the screen again. Otherwise, I've received your presentation. I'll be happy to share it for you. If it works for me, at least.
Just a note to the chair. I will have to leave at 6:30.
Okay, no problem.
Okay. Let's see.
I'll give you also the
don't understand. Yeah, I
no
have
worries.
to apologize. I
No
haven't
problem, no
used Google
problem.
Meet in like 2
I'm
years.
gonna try to share your presentation.
Yeah, I think I sent you the PDF. That might be easier than
Yeah.
the actual PowerPoint.
Okay. So can you see it?
It's loading, at least for me. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So Stephanie, go ahead. Just tell me when you wish me to change the slide.
Yes, thank you so much. I think we can move on to the first slide already. You've already introduced me, but I wanted to start by briefly saying a bit more about the project I'm part of and what we do. The project I work with is called Giving Voice to Digital Democracies, and this was established in 2018. And we are quite an interdisciplinary group of linguists, including myself, but also computer scientists and information engineers. And we kind of, next slide, please. Our main focus is on looking at language-based artificial intelligence applications, so artificially intelligent communications technology. Including things like speech technology and natural language processing, which I will say a bit more about later. And so we are mostly interested in these types of tools that involve language, be it text, be it video, images, and kind of looking at the ethical and societal implications of those technologies. Next slide, please. Yes, so maybe a bit more on what we've done so far. We've, for the longest time, looked at mostly online hate speech, and we've published a paper in 2020, I think it was, proposing a method of quarantining online hate speech, and I'm going to talk again more about this later on. We've also looked at multimodal hate speech detection and classification, so the combination of text and image. We've also hosted a number of workshops that I'm not going to go into detail. Now we've looked at misinformation and disinformation as well, and actually hosted a fact-checking hackathon in 2020, right before the pandemic started. We've also, or my colleagues rather, looked at the question of automating empathy, kind of in the context of mental health applications and therapy applications, and the kind of ethical elements of what this means to try and optimize empathy. I've worked also on mitigating gender bias in machine translation, looking at kind of how gendered language is translated from, let's say, English, a non-gender language, into a gendered language such as German or also Italian. And most recently, I've looked at kind of data statements and how to make them more interactive and more visual. And finally, I've also been very interested, and again, I will say more about this later, I've been very interested in counter-speech and also thinking about maybe semi-automated ways of generating counter-speech. Okay, next slide, please. So I want to start with basically talking a little bit about what polarization actually means, specifically from kind of my point of view and in the context of what I'm looking at and what I want to focus on in this presentation. So mostly in the literature, we distinguish between ideological and affective polarization. And I think they both kind of play a role in the context of technology and how technology kind of exacerbates polarization online, and also how we can maybe intervene and depolarize conversations. But what I actually found a lot more useful is the quote that you can see at the bottom, and which I'm going to read out shortly, because this looks at polarization, I think, from a more practical perspective. So this is a quote by Jacob Lefton, who is the technology and design lead of BuildUp, which is a nonprofit organization that specifically focuses on developing what they call peace-building technologies. So basically social bots, chat bots that kind of have the intention to depolarize communication online. And so what he says is, what polarization is as a phenomenon is that groups of people are separating from each other and building stereotypes of the other groups of people and losing shared facts and losing shared language to talk about the issues. And it doesn't matter if one side is right or wrong in this, if there can't be a healthy civic conversation. And I wanted to read out this quote because my background is in linguistics, and we focus specifically on language-based technology. And I think it's really important when we talk about polarization and maybe how to depolarize conversations to look at the language aspect, because this is kind of where it fails. A lot of our communication fails because we kind of can't really communicate effectively with each other anymore. So next slide, please. And so there are basically two questions I want to focus on in this talk, and I realize that probably my presentation is going to be a bit more general than the other two presentations. But I want to look first of all at the question what the role of technology is at the moment in increasing polarization in politics, in society, and other forms of life. And then also look at the question of how we can actually use technological tools to depolarize, or to make depolarization happen online. Next slide, please. Yeah, so basically the first question, how does artificial intelligence facilitate polarization? Next slide, please. So so basically a little bit of background, which probably is not going to be new to you, but I sort of wanted to establish a bit of common ground first. So I think we can all agree, and it's been kind of established, that polarization is on the rise, not just in countries that we usually see in the media like the United States, but it's been on the rise in a lot of countries. And at the same time, we can see that conversations, discussions have increasingly shifted to online platforms, where we, however, also see an increasing level of toxic communication and toxic conversations, and kind of further leading to segregation between people. As Riccardo also already mentioned, it's inherently in the design of a lot of social media, or all social media algorithms, that kind of feed into this creation of filter bubbles. So people only being in this bubble with like-minded people, creating these homogenous groups of shared ideas and shared ideologies. Next slide, please. I wanted to briefly mention that there are a few studies that I've looked at that also suggest that social media can actually also have depolarizing effects, which I found quite interesting. But then when you look at those studies in a bit more detail, you see that they interestingly always identify some special kind of characteristic that kind of stop this polarization effect from happening. In one case, it was the telling or mentioning of personal stories and experiences that kind of affected people in a positive way and then prevented depolarizing or depolarization. And in another case, it was noticed that polarization didn't happen because people showed that they had norms that made them very open-minded to different views and ideas. And I'm going to come back to that later on, because I think it can kind of help us in thinking about some of the techniques and tools we can use or implement to kind of appeal to those characteristics and traits. And yeah, I mean, on the one hand, we can say that information on social media is, of course, much more diverse than we would usually find it in traditional settings, like in friend groups or in traditional media. But at the same time, we're going to see that, I think on the next slide, kind of social media, as diverse as it is, also in its nature tends to restrict this diversity for the individual user. What I also want to briefly point out, and this is kind of why I started this presentation with kind of a definition, is that it seems like a lot of, especially social media studies, kind of there is a lack of shared definition of what the individual research groups or what the individual studies actually understand as polarization. And I want to point this out because similar to hate speech, having no uniform understanding or shared understanding makes it very difficult to find, I would say, an effective solution to it, and to make generalizations and comparisons and so on. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as I just mentioned, social media is incredibly diverse, but I think it was one of the first criticisms or the first mentions of filter bubbles and echo chambers, is that particularly the design of algorithms kind of limits these diverse choices to kind of narrow down or limit it for the user, so that you don't get overwhelmed by this huge amount of content that is out there on the internet. So they limit our choices, and they kind of create these isolated ideological communities or bubbles online. So it's basically up to the user. Of course, you can break out of an echo chamber if you're aware, and if you want to break out of it. There are ways to do it, but like the general design, I would say, is to kind of avoid this. So yeah, users tend to be exposed to similar content all the time. There are studies that show that Twitter users, for example, are more likely to share information that they see on the accounts of people that think in a similar way. So and the same applies to people we are friends with. Friends, I put that in parentheses, on social media. We are more likely to be friends, of course, with people who have the same kind of ideas and beliefs that we have. Next slide, please. And so one big problem is, of course, harmful content, and we've already heard really important information on the problem of fake news and disinformation. So we have disinformation on the one hand, we have hate speech on the other hand, and I think it's been shown in plenty of studies that this kind of leads to a further intensifies the segregation, the polarization of people on social media. I actually don't want to go through all of these very detailed definitions right now, so we can move to the next slide, please. Yeah, I just basically want to say a few more things about why hate speech and why disinformation are such a big problem and a serious problem. And just want to refer to a few studies that have actually shown that observing this harmful content online, especially hateful content, can also offline increase violence. It can cause serious psychological harm. It can cause trauma for people. It tends to normalize intolerance towards marginalized people with protected characteristics. And of course, also it can kind of promote and increase extremist ideas amongst people. And sadly, social media companies are aware of this, but seem very reluctant to actually change. We've seen this in some more recent documents and data. For example, last year, the documents that were revealed by the whistleblower Frances Haugen in October, which showed that, yes, Facebook is very aware of the problem, and they also know they're, in theory, really good at detecting these kinds of things because they have the best algorithms, or at least they have the money to develop them. But they do very little about it in action, in practice. And then maybe an even more recent problem, the Center for Countering Digital Hate has recently found, in the context of the war in Ukraine, that Facebook regularly fails to label more than 90% of posts that contain Russian propaganda about Ukraine as misinformation. So these are huge problems. Social media companies don't really do much about it. So the question is, what can we actually do about it? The next slide, please. Yes, so I'm now going to go through a number of different examples and techniques that we can use to help depolarize conversations. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, we look, or in our project, we work specifically, or we are interested in language-based applications. So that entails natural language processing. And I'm not sure, this might be a very, you might all be very familiar with this, and then I apologize for boring you with this, but sometimes people are not, and I find it helpful to just give a very brief summary of what natural language processing actually is and why do we need it specifically in this context. So natural language processing is basically an intersection between computer science and linguistics, where we use computational tools and methods to process large amounts of natural human language. And this is basically the foundation of a lot of tools and applications that probably all of us use already every day, such as grammar correction, harm prediction in emails, fake news detection, or when you're talking to a virtual agent such as Alexa or Siri. And it is also extremely important for any kind of hate speech detection, or also counter speech detection or generation. And two types of analysis are particularly important in this context, and those are sentiment analysis and network analysis. And I just want to briefly say a few words about those. Next slide, please. So sentiment analysis basically describes using computational tools to analyze and study people's opinions online. So let's say we have reviews online, product reviews from customers. Companies would be very interested in kind of analyzing those reviews, finding out how satisfied, dissatisfied our customers with our products. So using these tools, we can kind of learn more about people's opinions and emotions and attitudes towards products, but also people and other topics. Network analysis is also really important, especially, of course, in the context of social media, because we're literally looking at networks between different users, and we can identify the patterns of those users and how they are linked, and kind of the interests that they share and their interactions, and maybe events that they all equally kind of are interested in. And studying both sentiment and studying the interactions between people has become just a really important research area that goes far beyond computer science these days. Okay, next slide, please. So what I want to talk about for the remainder of my presentation is just to look at a few more of these examples and techniques in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to talk briefly about what is called digital nudging and the redirect method. Social bots are extremely important in this context, but also like a huge area. So I'm not going to go into detail here, which is why I put it in parentheses. So it's yeah, I had to decide on what to focus on, and social bots is just a very broad area. And then I'm going to focus on quarantining, so the method that we propose to mitigate online hate speech. And I'm going to finish with just saying very few words, because I think Marco is going to talk about this in more detail, about counter narratives and also about storytelling and how we can maybe use that to depolarize. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay. So I apologize that you're seeing both of this at the same time. Usually in PowerPoint, I would have done this one at a time, not to overwhelm everyone with lots of text. But these two methods are kind of linked or related. We have on the one hand digital nudging, which is a kind of a very persuasive method, also relying on recommendations and an algorithm making recommendations, suggestions for you as a user to look at additional relevant content to what you're already interested in. There are studies that show or indicate that this can actually improve decision-making in people, but of course there are also risks, such as it can lead to confirmation bias. Of course, if you're just recommended more content that is relative to what you're already interested in, it can just lead to you or to biases that already exist being more strengthened. But on the other hand, we can also use this kind of technique to kind of kind of enable the opposite. We can use it to maybe depolarize. So when someone is searching for something or repeatedly looking at specific content, an algorithm or also a chatbot can make suggestions that shows relevant content should still be relevant to, let's say, a search request, but slightly different content. So not to be too different from what the person is interested in, not to be too opposing, but slightly go in a different direction and to nudge people to maybe look at different viewpoints, opinions as well. And this is directly connected, I would say, to the redirect method. The redirect method is kind of linked to nudging a little bit. And here it's already the goal to use targeted advertising to lead people away from harmful content and to strategically suggest different opinions, different kind of content. And Riccardo has already mentioned this in the context of COVID-19. Like Facebook has used this, and I think Twitter. I'm not sure if they actually also used the redirect method, but I know for sure that Facebook definitely did. So if you searched for COVID-19, you were directed away, specifically away from any kind of websites or Facebook sites that would promote fake news, misinformation, and you would be directed towards credible sources like the World Health Organization, for example. And I also recently found out that actually the Internet Watch Foundation here in Cambridge actually uses something different. They use a chatbot to redirect people on porn sites away from searching for sexual content that might involve children. So they're also applying this method to kind of course, you have to be very careful in what kind of language you use there, but it can certainly be useful in making people aware and maybe turning them towards safer options and sources. And next slide, please. So yeah, I want to look at specifically hate speech for the next few minutes. So, I mean, you probably already know this. The current method to identify hate speech and to deal with hate speech by social media companies and governments is to use mostly content moderation, often in combination with algorithms, but it's still oftentimes a human being that actually checks content and makes sure it's in line with companies' guidelines. And this is a very reactive approach. So someone needs to report it, it is then moderated, and that may or may not lead to deletion or blocking of an account, or at least of a post. Yes, so just to mention it, but of course, there has been all this really important and valuable research also on the unethical side of human content moderation and what that actually means for the people who have to look at this kind of content. So we were basically thinking about, is there any way that we can kind of like find the middle ground between censorship and freedom of speech and maybe give control back to the user. Next slide, please. So what we proposed in the paper in 2020 was to quarantine hate speech, similar to how viruses are quarantined on computers or on your smartphone. So we would use, or we would rely on automatic hate speech detection. And when a potentially offensive post is identified, it automatically gets quarantined, and the potential recipient is then prompted with a warning and can basically choose if they want to read the message or not, and also whether the message should be posted or not. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of what this could look like. Basically, I'm not even showing this. This is an actual example of someone who received a very homophobic comment on their Facebook page, I think it was. And this is what the kind of quarantining method could look like. So the user will not see the message. Instead, they will see an alert, a warning saying, okay, this could be homophobic hate speech. Do you want to see this post or not? And at the same time, as you can see on the right-hand side, the user is given a kind of confidence score, or at least it is based on a confidence score, where the system basically gives an indication of how certain it is that this post does contain hate speech. And so the user can decide, okay, this is like in the red 90% sure, this is hateful, I don't want to see it. Next slide, please. So yeah, this value is basically generated from a confidence score between 0 and 1, from not harmful to extremely harmful. And what it basically does is add additional friction. So we all know that in the modern tech world, friction is a very unpopular term, but I think in the context of like reducing harmful content online and also reducing polarization, I think a good idea is to add different degrees of friction again into online communication. And this can be implemented as a browser extension or an app. We've actually developed an app, which, next slide, please. Which I originally wanted to show. I don't think you can actually show it in the PDF, I suppose. Probably not. I assume this is kind of what killed my being able to share the PowerPoint. But so this, yeah, so we had an app developed by one of our engineering students here in Cambridge, which would basically show that simultaneously you would get a warning both as the author of a message, so you would be told, okay, this is potentially harmful, what you're posting, are you really sure you want to post this? And at the same time, if the system detects a message that contains harmful content, it would immediately blur the post so that it's not visible to the receiver, and the receiver would receive the warning, a warning like you've just seen with the hateometer give an indication of how sure the system is that the content is truly hateful. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is the final thing I want to just briefly address. So hate speech identification is one element. Quarantining hate speech is, I would say, one approach to it. Another approach that we've been increasingly interested in is using counter speech or counter narratives to oppose hate speech online. And counter speech basically goes back to the idea of responding to hateful or harmful speech, specifically seeking to undermine it. And the idea of counter speech is not necessarily to make an offender change their mind or to apologize, but it is essentially to reach bystanders or to reach people who might be on the verge of becoming offenders themselves, and essentially preventing that. And so there are different types of counter speech. I suppose we might be hearing more about this in the next talk. Yeah, there could potentially also be targeted counter speech specifically to prevent polarization. And there are different studies that have found, for example, that counter speech can increase the number of positive responses that will follow underneath a hateful comment. And it has also been shown that particularly empathy-based counter speech can be very effective in reducing especially racist hate speech. And this kind of brings me to the last point, which I find really interesting, and that is the idea of stories or storytelling. So we know from research in cognitive science and neuroscience that storytelling can be extremely powerful, and it can help establish tolerance if it appeals to people's empathy. So like inviting people to see or view a situation from someone else's perspective, to put yourself into someone else's shoes. And there is research that actually shows that it activates the emotion center of the brain. So there's actual neurological evidence that this is quite powerful and effective. And of course, storytelling is also a research area in conversational AI. And I want to address that this is still probably far from having or creating perfect results. But I find it really interesting, the idea of collaborative storytelling and the idea of a human and an AI working together to create stories. I find this particularly interesting, and I wanted to mention this because it has been addressed in radicalization research and in polarization research, and that this could be potentially really useful in preventing these kinds of developments of extreme thoughts in people and extreme beliefs, and kind of got me thinking into maybe we could kind of automate this, semi-automate this, to use very short and personal and emotional stories to kind of appeal to people. Next slide, please. Yes, and so this is basically the last thing I want to address, and that is kind of the idea of a counter-speech prompter, maybe in combination with the kind of storytelling element, because from my point of view, there is fully automated counter-speech at the moment is really extremely difficult for several reasons, including that it's very time-consuming and laborious to manually annotate a data set, a large enough data set to produce satisfactory outcomes, which has to do with the wide range of communicative strategies that we can just use as humans in different conversations. And also, as different more recent studies have shown, we need a great diversity of responses, and the responses have to be really relevant to whatever the original post is. So I've been kind of looking more into this idea of how we could use a semi-automated approach, or how we could use AI to assist actual human counter speakers, or people who maybe want to use counter speech but don't really know where to start or how to do it correctly or appropriately. And so the idea would be to kind of use something similar to Smart Compose or reply suggestions that we have on Microsoft Office, where depending on what type of original hate speech comment or disinformation a system can identify, the algorithm would give you suggestions as to how you could respond to this. And I would be hopeful that this would help people overcome this initial hurdle and would motivate people more to actually respond and intervene and kind of intersect at that boundary where people, especially the people in the middle, could be convinced to maybe not fall for a hateful comment, for a racist comment, or for fake news. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. I apologize if I'm talking too long. Yes, so as like to finish this off, I just want to address some final challenges and considerations that I think we should maybe bear in mind. I think we need more studies to look at the effectiveness of the different techniques. So what does actually work in what context? So what kind of technique would be best to prevent polarization and to help depolarize situations? I think algorithms need to be more adaptive. So because content is constantly changing, so we ideally need kind of algorithms that are based on training data that is consistently, frequently updated. I think that solutions cannot solely be reactive, so we have to look more at preventative methods and proactive methods. One question that I cannot and I don't want to answer, but maybe an interesting question to discuss: who decides what's actually wrong or right? And I think finally just finding the right balance, because getting rid of all the bad stuff out there, getting rid of polarization entirely, I think would also be very unhealthy and would not be a good balance. So finding that balance, I think, is a very important consideration. Okay, next and final slide is just thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie, for this a very clear but very profound and also informative presentation. Sorry for the slight interruption in your presentation. I had to let someone in the conversation from the outside. I couldn't see it from the screen. I wonder whether we could have a break and have a little bit of discussion, because I wouldn't like to leave to let Riccardo leave without having some questions or comments to his paper. So maybe we can have a little break, and start with some comments and questions, because Riccardo has to leave at 6:30. So then if Marco presents now, there's going to be too little time to discuss this paper. And now I welcome questions on the first two papers, and we're going to end with Marco's presentation. So any comments or questions about Riccardo's paper or Stephanie's paper? They were very rich and very different, but at the same time very connected, and they gave us a very vivid impression of how complex this field is. So the floor is open for comments and questions at the moment. I have a lot of questions myself, but Boris, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, can you hear me? I have a question for Riccardo. First of all, thank you very much for these very, very interesting talks. Listening to you, Riccardo, I was wondering, have you ever thought about why it is that the models that you use, which originally come from physics, work in modeling polarization as well? I mean, that's kind of, for someone from the outset, that's kind of surprising, isn't it? One wouldn't expect this. Of course, we are I'm not really surprised because we know about these things for quite some time now, but has anyone ever spent some time reflecting on why those models should work in something completely different, in a completely different area?
Yes, indeed. The name of my group, my unit, is called Complex Human Behavior. And in the framework of complexity, what matters the most is not what is the actor or the agent or the entity that constitutes what is moving in the system, but rather what are the interactions between them. So if the interaction is, I want to be similar, sorry, this is my mama. If the interactions are, is what is important is the interaction, and in the, my mama broke my floor. So if you're a piece of metal or you're a human being, the same mathematics applies. It applies the fact that you prefer to align to others. And so what changes is the structure where all this is happening. In all the example I showed you, you were lattice, because matter normally is isotropic. All pieces of metal of part of a magnet have one that is a right, left, up and down. What then makes everything different is the fact that we are in a social network that normally is not that even, and we have hubs that lead the polarizations, and people who have less number of friends or followers. So the mathematics is the same, but then the structure of the network where we play the model is completely different.
Thank you.
Alberto has a question. Alberto Romello.
Sorry, do you hear me?
I do, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you very much. It was really interesting, both Riccardo and Stephanie. And I think I have a question for both of you, so you can decide. I must say that until Stephanie's last word, I was pending on Elon Musk's side. I was thinking, well, you were talking about digital nudging, social bots, and quarantining as solutions to avoid polarization, but they are, well, they are technical solution to technical problems. And the main ethical question is, who is going to decide to apply this kind of technical solution to technical problems? Is it a private company? Is it a researcher? Is it an engineer? Is it a public institution? I mean, that's exactly the point where the ethical issues arise. And that's why I really appreciate when Stephanie talked about storytelling, which is a non-technical solution. But again, the problem arises: who is going to apply that? Who is going to impose? Is there any kind of imposition? Is it? I mean, you see the ethical problem here. I would not say that technicality is the solution to such a technical problem. At least I ask myself this kind of question. So I would like to hear your feedback about that, which is of course a huge problem, I realize.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I don't, as I said earlier, I don't even have an answer to this. I guess this is kind of why we suggested something like quarantining, which is basically in the hands of the user. So I doubt that any kind of social media company, one of the bigger companies, would implement something like this on their platforms. So kind of thinking about, and you're right, of course, it's a technological solution to a technological problem, and the question is, of course, and that's where we probably need more long-term studies to see, could that actually have effects on people's opinions long-term, on people's behavior, not just online but also offline. So I guess my opinion or my thought would be to kind of always try and find something that the user can use themselves. Something like an app, something like a browser extension, not having to rely on government laws or social media company guidelines. But I realize that's probably not a very satisfactory answer.
Well, but it's the beginning of an answer, so thank you.
And Riccardo, do you have any comments on that? Microphone. The mic.
No, not really. On the technological side, I stay more neutral normally. I just observe what is happening, but I'm not in the design of solutions.
That's the answer of a physicist who don't want to engage in such kind of answer. Thank you.
I have to stay neutral for having unbiased opinions.
Any other questions or comments?
Maybe if there
Lucia,
is one more
Lucia
minute. I just wanted to thank you. I am wondering about the counter narratives, because clearly we can understand when we are facing an hate speech or a discrimination discourse, but I always wonder how can we prepare a counter narrative that is respectful of other positions. I mean, also a counter narrative can have an ideological orientation, or can be, like to say, a medium of a discourse that has that could be biased. And so I always think from a in terms of contents, how can we create or plan technologies or algorithms that can help to create counter narratives that can avoid this kind of biases or other possible ideological orientations. So it's very naive, the question, but it is still...
It's just a little premature, because like Marco is the expert on counter narrative, so
okay.
I believe you have to do it after his talk.
Okay, I will await. Thank you so much.
Maybe Stephanie can have something to contribute to this question, just as an anticipation.
Yeah, I would have said something similar. Maybe let's hear from Marco first, but that's a really valid point. I think in this context, we need to look at what people are actually doing on social media themselves. So and that is an issue, like getting that data in the first place and using that data as a kind of template for what is good and effective counter speech. There's also research that looks at using experts, using people who work for NGOs, for human rights groups, and kind of having them sketch out good counter-speech responses. And studies have found that these are usually more effective than just having a lay person do it. But essentially, I think it comes down to very human values, just being nice, being respectful, not being hateful in return, and appealing to people's empathy, just appealing to people's capability to maybe just see a situation from a different standpoint.
Thank you,
But
Stephanie.
I'm very interested to hear what Marco has to say.
Maybe a last question, if I may, to Riccardo and also Stephanie, if she wants to contribute as well. Does quantity become quality? So there is an effect of the size of the network on the tendency to polarization?
Normally they don't. The kind of the network the society built are called scale-free. It means that the properties are like fractal. If you take one subset of it, it is still with the one hub and a lot of followers. So for some reasons, we are organized like this. one of the reasons is the fact that the more someone has ability to attract or being visible, the more it gains more followers. And so, given these mathematical properties, normally size doesn't really matter.
Okay, I see Paolo Costa has a question, has raised his hand. Paolo, go ahead. And then we'll give the floor to Marco.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. Well, my question is a sort of curiosity, but also a doubt about what's going on in your community of researchers. Because, of course, are we really talking about depolarizing the debate? Because, of course, if you have a strong moral point of view, of course, you're going to have a very polarized view of the debate, good and bad, of course. So what you want is something different. You want people change the mind, of course, bad people becoming good people. And do you ever discuss this? Well, if this is your goal, and if this is possible, where you want to reach this goal there on the web, that is not the good place where to look for that sort of solution to the problem. Or what you want to do is get rid of the bad people simply, or quarantine them, or make them less effective. Because, of course, these are two different strategies, two different goals. So that's just a curiosity. Do you ever discuss about this in your community? Because that seems to me to be a very interesting question. Do we want to change bad people into good people? Or do we want to have a different kind of effect?
Thank you, Paolo. I guess it's a question for the three of, our speakers, but maybe Stephanie first.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And yes, we do. At least I can speak for my research group. We do talk about these problems, and this is also, I think it was literally the last point that I mentioned about finding the right balance. And that I do think that it's impossible to get rid of polarization, and B, it would be unhealthy to get rid of all polarization, because it's having different opinions, having different worldviews is, I would say, necessary to have a healthy balance and a healthy. It's part of what makes democracy a democracy, isn't it? To have different people coming together. Also compromise, and also realizing sometimes I might be wrong, you might be right. But I think what has gotten lost is the ability to have a civic conversation, regardless of whether or not we agree or disagree. And I think our hope is that, so I don't believe that getting rid of all the bad people on the internet is going to be the solution, but I think it's maybe moderating it a little bit to say this is not reaching the people who observe these interactions and these conversations, and kind of making them aware that this is not normal and this is not necessarily how we should communicate. We can have different opinions, but we shouldn't do it in a hateful way. We should do it in a respectful way. And that's why I think counter speech can be really useful. And that's why I also think quarantining a message is better than deleting content and blocking people, because that's not going to help anyone, in my opinion.
Okay, I will try to. Ethics is a bit far from my field, but I can make a parallel with the problem of epidemics. In epidemics, you can be like the victim, considered as the victim of the epidemics, or like the vector. When you're sick, you're suffering because you got sick. But when you're sick, you are also the responsibilities of reducing the way you spread the sickness. Now, like, I don't know where you stay with the Green Pass problem, but most of the people who protest for the Green Pass focus on the right to be not victim of the vaccination, but they ignore the ethical aspect of being the vector of the transmission. Something similar is for disinformation or for hate speech. On one side, you can be the victim of the hate speech, but or the victim of an action that try to change your opinion. On the other side, there is your responsibility as a vector. When you are online and you're not aware, and you retweet some piece of information that can increase disinformation, can increase expiece of toxicity, that is something that is ethically, let's say, at least parallel. So I see these, I see actions that are trying to reduce the spreading, like minor nudging, questions about, are you sure you want to share this, or counter narratives that act when you are sharing something and say, yeah, look, what you just shared is not exactly what you want, you probably want to share. Some sort of, I'm asking to people to put the mask more than quarantine. This, I don't know if I explain myself, but with this parallel.
Yeah, just a short follow-up. Of course, my sort of provocation was to invite you to think about, well, the risk of thinking about moral problems in terms of health, for example. So to make a sort of parallel between being morally wrong and being sick, of course, because the physical models works very well, of course, if you think of morally bad people as sick people, of course. But if you want to change them, of course, instead of quarantining them, I think there is another problem. So the physical model can be useful, of course, but at the same time poses some big questions about the way we understand moral change. And moral change is very important, of course, because I think the very big problem with our new forms of communication today is precisely the way we handle with this possibility of moral change. Moral change is a crucial aspect, appears to me, for democracy, of course, because polarization is good as far as it may enable moral change or improve or make it more likely. Yeah, that's the sort of thought or provocation I wanted. Yeah, this is useful, of course, but if we don't think about what it means to change morally from a bad to a good position, of course, we lack something very, very important. That was just my intention, yes. So thank you very much.
I'm actually curious what Marco thinks about this, since I will be leaving before I can enter in the discussion.
Yeah, I think it's time to give him the floor, but maybe like for a spontaneous reaction now.
Just from Stephanie, I agree with what Stephanie already said about counter-narrative from the counter-narrative perspective, which is basically you don't want to change the mind of haters, you might want to address bystanders, okay? So it's not about eliminating hate, but somehow it's mitigating the risk of hate spreading. And I don't completely agree, I'm sorry, with, okay, every position, every idea is equally acceptable, not at all. When we talk about hate, we talk basically about, I beg your pardon, shit, okay? Really bad stuff. We have to kill Jews, okay? This is the kind of material we have to cope with, okay? And basically, we might avoid censorship, but still the problem remains, okay? How to somehow inhibit this extreme content. And basically, counter-narrative is one of these ideas. We have been working on it for many years, applying artificial intelligence and NLP. We got really impressive results on the use of NLP suggestion tools. But I can also tell you an anecdotal thing. I don't know what does this mean, but while working, for example, with the Amnesty International Task Force Against Hate Speech, I've been working a lot with the members, the volunteers of this task force, and they told that they noticed at a certain point that the haters, after they started countering hate content, slightly over the months and over the years changed their attitude. So they took a kind of counter-narrative perspective in terms of style, okay? They basically were not so overt in their hate. They were trying to be more argumentative, at least from a superficial point of view, but basically they were still promoting the same hateful content. So if you look from afar, you might say, oh, look, the conversation became more civilized, more polite, but actually it didn't really change, okay? So is it changing just the argumentative style a way to reduce polarization? I'm not sure about that, okay? So I don't have
It's
a real answer.
definitely a big question. We can say also that hate speech is certainly polarized, but not all polarized speech is hate speech, of course. So that complicates things. Just a very quick comment by Alberto, and then we give the floor to Marco for the last intervention. Alberto?
If there is no time, I just keep my question.
No, go ahead.
Okay, it was just thank you, Marco. It's a really good point. I think my question is always not about the fact that hate content is shit, which is of course true, but about who has the right to say that that kind of content is shit. And that's another kind of topic. I'm not sure that researchers, engineers, computer scientists are those who are entitled to do that.
Yeah. Alberto, I'm a philosopher, first of all, and then
no, but it's not about it.
So, yeah.
It's not about you. It's not about you, of course.
What I'm saying is that when we build these kind of tools, we also have the expertise to ask the right question, in my opinion, of course. So we thought a lot about this, then I will start the presentation, maybe. And the answer is, of course, from a philosophical perspective, if you want to go into perspectivism, every opinion has exactly the same truth value, the same value. I don't completely agree on this, in the sense that being in a civilized society, what we can say, look, the difference is that we stick to the Declaration of Human Rights, okay? All our arguments start from that one. Whatever goes against it, for us, is something which is bad. This is a very simple standpoint. It's like in mathematics. At a certain point, you have to stop asking questions and to decide that these are the foundational statement that define my action, my axiom, my theorems, and so on and so forth. Okay. Basically, for us, we start from the Declaration of Human Rights. Whatever contradicts this, in my opinion, has not the same value as other things. Okay.
Thank you. Indeed, an interlocutor that we should also involve in the next conversation is a jurist, because jurists do have a definition of what hate speech is, and of course hate speech is defined differently according to the different legal frameworks. But there is always a strong accent on the fact that hate speech is usually connected with hate action. There is a contiguity between speech and action that makes hate speech particularly dangerous. But anyway, this is very a thorny topic.
But Massimo, we are entering a very complex field. But
absolutely,
the problem is that hate speech legal definition cannot solve the problem, because there are many situations. I don't have the technical term for this. Maybe Stefanie has a technical term, of speeches that are basically dangerous, even if they are not hate speech. I give you a concrete example. Since this minority came to live in my neighbor, I feel more unsafe at night. Or I'm scared by this minority. This is not hate speech, but still the outcome, and you cannot jail person for saying this, but still the outcome is promoting hate, okay? So it's very difficult to just rely on legal definition. I believe that legal definition are not the solution. That's why we pursued so much in the last years the concept of counter-narratives, especially because you don't need a definition of a legal definition of hate speech in order to answer to those speeches that might be dangerous for society.
Absolutely. This is also the limit of of the legal framework. It captures just some of the phenomenon, but not all.
And I'm sorry if I get so fired up about the topic, but I really
no problem. It's your topic of investigation, so it's good that you are so passionate about it. But let me introduce you because you also deserve an introduction. Dr. Marco Guerini is a researcher in computational linguistics and head of the Language and Dialogue Technologies Group at the Fondazione Bruno Kessler. He works on persuasive communication, sentiment analysis, and social media. In recent years, he focused on the development of AI technologies to counter online hate speech and disinformation. He graduated in philosophy and received his doctoral degree in PhD in Information and Communication Technologies in 2006 from the University of Trento. He's the author of several scientific publications published in conference proceedings and international journals. So finally, last but not least, the floor is yours, Marco.
Thanks a lot. And let me share my screen. Just 1 second. Okay. Do you see my screen?
Yes, we do. Perfectly.
Okay, perfect. So first of all, a little introduction about this presentation, because at the beginning, I was guessing which kind of direction I want to give to this talk. Maybe a more philosophical talk would have been better, but instead, since I didn't know from the beginning the direction of this seminar, I decided to give you a story, more or less, a story of what is behind artificial intelligence for counter-narrative. Why? Because basically the problem, in my opinion, is that in the mainstream communication, you really see an hype on artificial intelligence, but actually, I would like to give you the perspective of people really working on artificial intelligence and let you understand not only the incredible results that we can obtain, but also the main challenges that are still in front of us. And I hope that with this presentation, some of the doubts, some of the hints that Stephanie gave can be answered, okay? So before starting, let me give you the standard disclaimer that this presentation contains offensive language, and of course, they do not represent the view of the authors. Additionally, many of the examples will be about Islamophobia, because we have been working, the first project we have been working on for counter-narrative generation was about Islamophobia, so many of the examples come from this, even if now we have enlarged our view to many different phenomena of hate that I will mention briefly at the end. So first of all, some context that has been already discussed a bit. Hate speech, loosely speaking, refer to expression that attack or incite violence and hate against groups based on specific characteristics such as religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and so on and so forth. The point is that we are in front of a vicious circle, because usually, thinking about the topic of the present seminar, hate speech deepens polarization, and polarization in turn produces more hate speech. So the point is that we have to basically cut this circle. We have an additional problem. The additional problem is that with the rapid growth of social media platforms, the abusive, offensive, and hateful language can spread quickly and is difficult to monitor. Moreover, hate speech is not just an online phenomenon. Hate speech, even online, can have real-life consequences. It can lead to depression or suicide, it can promote the use of violence, encourage discrimination, and increase societal division, also called polarization. Of course, we saw from the society an unprecedented effort to provide adequate responses in terms of laws and policies to mitigate hate content on social media platforms. So before moving to counter narratives, the context is that the standard policies that has been put forward up to now are based on an identify and sanction kind of approach. So we can have content deletion, user suspension, and shadow banning. What does that mean? We have the stream of post provided by a user. We have a first step in which we identify in this stream what could be potential hateful content. In this case, Muslims should not exist in our modern world because all they do is violence. And then once we identify the content and maybe we forward it to a human for validation, what we can do, we can remove that particular content, or we can shadow ban this content. What does that mean? Basically, we hide this particular post from the search results of other users. So basically, other users are not able to reach this content. Or we can even suspend the user. That is to say, we remove all its content or its online activity. So, which has been the first contribution of artificial intelligence to hate speech countering? Up to now, the focus, which was a huge focus, many groups around the world working on this, they tried to build natural language processing systems that are able to classify content. Basically, by reading this content, this system should be able to tell if it is hateful or not. So again, we have this content, which is Muslims should not exist in our modern world, blah, blah, blah. And we have, for example, a modern neural network that reads this and tells, look, this is an hateful content. You should take an action over it. If the neural network is good enough, it should be also able to distinguish content with similar wording but different non-hateful semantics. So Muslims have the right to exist. It is not true that all they do is violence. The wording is very similar to the previous one, but in this case, it should be passed because it's not hateful. Of course, as already stated, these approaches have some limitation, because these approaches can be charged basically with censorship and overblocking, so they can hinder the freedom of speech. And as I was mentioning before, starting my presentation, they cannot be applied to problematic speech. That is to say, content that is stirring up hatred and divisiveness and polarization, but do not fall into a formal definition or into a legal definition of hate speech. So they can be based on true but spurious correlation, or they can just express emotion, like, since Muslims started arriving in our country, there has been a spike in violent crimes. Might be a completely true statement based on a spurious correlation. So is it legitimate to remove it? I don't know. Or if someone says, I'm scared by Muslim, it's just expressing an emotion. Maybe not so nice emotion, but still, should be this content removed? I don't know. So the idea is to take a completely different approach. That is to say, to focus on counter-narratives. This is an alternative strategy that has received little attention so far in the last few years by the AI community. The idea is to actually oppose hate content with textual response. So a counter-narrative is a direct intervention in the discussion that counter hate messages using a non-aggressive, this is fundamental also to answer one of the questions that I think Lucia made, non-aggressive textual responses that offer feedback based on fact-bound arguments. So for example, if you attack something, you attack the argument, never the person, and so on and so forth. And so these are some of the tips and suggestions on how to write a proper counter-narrative. Basically, a proper counter-narrative prevent and preserve the right to freedom of speech. It counters stereotypes with credible evidence. It can alter the viewpoints of haters, maybe less, but bystanders for sure. It can encourage mutual understanding. It can help de-escalate the conversation. And this tip that you see on the right, tips come from the Get the Troll Out project. So we have been talking about counter-narratives, but what is a counter-narrative? So let me give you an example of a very well-formed counter-narrative. Again, our usual hate speech about Muslim, they should not exist, all they do is violence. And a well-formed counter-narrative intervention use arguments to support the counter standpoint and challenge the opponent's viewpoint. So a possible counter-narrative could be, the world would actually be a very dark place without Muslims who contribute a lot to our society or to our nation. What about our Muslim doctors, scientists, actors, job creation? Actually, this is a counter-narrative that was written during one of our data collection sessions by one of our NGO operators that was specifically trained in writing counter-narratives. So, who are the usual actor writing counter-narrative? There are NGO operators, as I was telling you, that are training volunteers to intervene with counter-narratives. So we have been working for some years with Amnesty International, Stop Hate UK, Amnesty International Italia, Stop Hate UK in UK, and Collective Contre l'Islamophobie en France for the French language. Why we started working with them? Because in our project, their need was clear. Their problem is that manual intervention alone is not scalable. The sheer amount of hate generated online on a daily basis is simply too much to be manually countered. So what we did was to build a complete, we built this complete online interface that allowed them both to explore the network of hate content online and to address the hate speech they found. In particular, today, I will not talk about this interface, but I will talk about one particular tool that we developed, which was, as Stefanie was suggesting, it would be nice to have. Actually, we built it, a suggestion tool for operators that suggested them possible responses. So basically, this tool was very simple. It was a tool to assist NGO operators in fighting hate speech. What we provided to them was a partial automation of CN writing through the use of natural language generation AI suggestion. What we found in our studies, which was striking, is the drastic reduction in time needed to compose a counter-narrative. Basically, with even the more basic algorithm, the most trivial one, we managed to halve the time needed to them to write a proper counter-narrative. So basically, we managed to, even with the most basic algorithm, to double the effectiveness in countering hate speech. So, how does this suggestion tool works? Basically, we have a speech. Every Muslim is a potential terrorist. In the interface, the user had the opportunity to click this bubble here. And basically, this bubble activates our algorithm that basically provide possible counter-narratives to these suggestions. So the system was designed to provide possible alternative counter-narratives, not only one, but more than one. So are you suggesting that their existence is an excuse for your hate, or it is our action that makes us criminal, not whichever fate we follow, and so on and so forth. The point, and this is the story I want to tell you today, is that by building this tool that I just presented you here, is not so easy, basically because you need two main things, algorithm and data. The first part of the presentation will be focused on algorithms. The algorithms for generating this suggestion, this counter-narrative suggestion, can be of several types. We can have information retrieval algorithms that basically pick up an answer written by humans from a database. Or we can have standard neural networks that generate counter-narratives, or we can use very recent let me use this term, super powerful neural networks that are called pre-trained large language models that can be used for generate novel counter-narratives. Or we can also use knowledge-driven generation in which we pair pre-trained language models with external resources. So the first algorithm, information retrieval, I also give you the pointers to the publication if you are interested, is based on the idea of building a very simple data set where we have a term document matrix starting from our database. So we have hate speech and counter narrative. What we do is transform these in each entry into a term document matrix. Basically, what it does, we have on the columns all our terms, vocabulary, and for each example, we tell if that particular word is present in the example. So in the first document or the hate speech counter narrative, we have the term Muslim, terrorist, potential, but we don't have secularism or contrary that are present in the document too. So you see contrary and secularism are present in this example, but not in this one where there is Muslim and terrorist. Okay. So basically what we can do is that when a new hate speech is presented, we can build its term document matrix. So say, oh, look, this hate speech contains the term Muslim, terrorist, but does not contain contrary and secularism. And so we might look in our database which one is the entry that matches most of its terms. And basically we discover that is this one. So what we can simply do is to pick up the response to that hate speech that was written by the human operator. So in this case, the counter narrative is every Muslim is also a potential peacemaker, doctor, philanthropist, blah, blah, blah. What's your point? What are the advantages and limitations of this approach? Of course, we get always grammatical responses because they are human written. The problem is that they can be meaningful, but not always relevant. And this approach is completely deterministic. That is to say, if there are different NGO operators that are operating at the same time on the same hate speech, they will receive the same response. And if they don't manually modify it, they will end up posting exactly the same content. So the next approach, which is a bit older right now, but still interesting, is to use standard neural networks. What does that mean? We start from scratch. Basically, we have a neural network which is not trained, and we started feeding to this neural network input and output in order that the neural network is able to learn connection between hate speech and counter narratives. So we give the first example with the corresponding counter narrative, and the neural network starts to arrange its internal weights in order to learn how to respond. The more example we give, the more the neural network is trained, and it better learn how to respond up to the point in which it's fully trained. So basically, given a new hate speech, it's able to generate a new counter-narrative. Advantages and limitations of this approach: they can create new sequences, new counter-narratives, but they cannot create new arguments because basically they are not able to use new words. And they can also create ungrammatical or not well-formed counter-narratives like this one. That is not true. There are many Muslims contrary to secularism, which is not a well-formed counter-narrative. This is a real example anyway. Moreover, they are not robust to unseen words at different time. So, for example, if during training the neural network never saw the word pedophile, it's not able to answer in a proper way to this counter-narrative. So, sorry, to this hate speech. So it might end up saying, replying to all Muslims are pedophile with, on the contrary, there are many Muslims in favor of secularism, because this neural network was trained just on the data that we provided. For this reason, we started using, pre-trained language models, okay, that are more powerful, more powerful neural networks. So, basically, what is a pre-trained language model? A pre-trained language model is a neural network that represents a statistical probability distribution over sequences of words. It's a very simple concept. Basically, this neural network is able to represent this probability function. That is to say, given a sequence of words, tell me which are the most probable next word. So the probability of mouse given the cat chases the mouse, of course, this is very high. This has a very high probability. Or the cat chases the ball, again, ball has a very high probability. Instead, cliff has a low probability because this is not a word that usually you find after the cat chases the. So basically, how these neural networks are trained? In a very simple way. Basically, what researchers did was to make this neural network read billions of sentences. So basically, they learn the distribution of the probability distribution of words. So by reading millions of sentences, they learned that usually mouse come after the cat chases the or ball, but not cliff. How you use this network in generation? It's very simple. You give the cat chases the as a context, and the neural network say, oh, look, the next word might be mouse. Then you add the mouse to the context, and you get it as a next most probable word in. Then the garden. And by keeping on with this loop, you can generate very complex sentences. This is an example of very complex science fiction generated text. And it's very good, actually. It's very coherent and very impressive. Okay, how can we use this neural network in our scenario? Our problem here is that in our scenario, we have basically two different probability distribution over sequences of words. One probability is for counter-narrative. The other probability is for hate speech. So Islam is a religion of, if it is an hate speech, the most probable next word is hate. But if we look at the counter-narrative, the most probable next word is peace. Islam is a religion of peace. So what we did was to use special tags in the text to give the proper context to the generation probability. I mean, this is a trick that we have to come up with in order to properly train our neural network, our large language model. So we gave a tag like, look, this is an hate speech, so Islam is a religion of, most probable next word is hate. Instead, if we give the tag of start of counter-narrative, Islam is a religion of, the model would output peace, because we give to the model the explicit context of hate speech or counter-narrative. What is the idea of fine-tuning the language model? Instead of starting from a tabula rasa, as in the previous example, we use this pre-trained language model that is already trained to do part of the task. That is to say, it knows that mouse is chased by cats. So we go from here to here. There are many advantages with these neural networks. This neural network can create new counter-narratives with new unseen words that were not present in the training data. They can sometimes create new arguments. Of course, sometimes they can also create meaningless response as a drawback. But also they can invent wrong argument. And this is a very debated topic about artificial intelligence that really needs a lot of work to be solved. And this is why I also tell, look, the hype around artificial intelligence is not always right. So this is a real example of the output of one of our trained neural network. Muslims are invading our country was the input, and our neural network generated. Actually, there were 1690,308 sorry, Muslim in the UK in 2016. So if you exclude London, that is actually increasing by 2%, which doesn't seem very significant. It seems quite a good argument that might need some mending up by end, but it might seem a very good argument. Still, the problem is that according to the ONS, the Muslim population in UK is only just above 3 million. So it completely invented the number of Muslims. And this is really problematic because you cannot fight hate speech with not well-formed counter-narratives, so with fake numbers. For this reason, we also tried an additional advanced approach. I won't go into much details here, but basically what we want to address is to overcome the problem of reliable generation that I just showed you. So we again turn back to our NGO operators, and we know that often they use external resources for writing their counter-narratives. So what we did was basically to provide to the neural network the same information. So we add to our training data sentences from Wikipedia and or other newspaper that contain relevant information in order to write the counter narrative. Okay, here highlighted with different colors. So basically now our neural network is able to take in input an hate speech and a bunch of document. It looks through this bunch of document and is able to produce, tries to produce a proper counter narrative using relevant evidence present in this database of Wikipedia entries and news articles. Okay, so far so good. We have many different algorithms that we can use, but still, as also Stephanie pointed out, we have the problem of data. So we have been working actively in the last years, not only on algorithms for generating counter narratives, but also on data. Why? Because, sorry, is there a question? Because I heard...
No, go ahead, Mark. It was just one of the participants saying goodbye and thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, because I don't see you, so, gosh, sorry, I lost the focus. Here it is, it should be. Okay. So all the algorithms that I show you are data-driven. That is to say, they rely on data in order to produce new counter-narratives or to respond to hate speech. So there has been, the problem is that there is a lack of a sufficient amount of quality data. There is an high cost in collecting such data. And so we studied several strategies to collect this data. So crawling was one of the first strategies that was used by some research groups, then crowdsourcing. Instead, we use niche sourcing and hybrid approaches, and also advanced hybrid approaches. Crawling, basically, was used by these people that actively work on counter-narrative generation as well. They basically scraped the web by searching first for hateful content and then manually look through the responses to see if there are possible counter-narratives written by real people to these hate speeches. The advantages and limitation of this approach. Potentially, you can have a huge amount of data, but still it requires a lot of manual filtering, and there is no control over the produced material. So what we found in their dataset is that there are many aggressive counter messages that do not comply with what we consider a proper counter narrative. So this is an example that they provide. Muslims should not exist in our modern world because all they do is violence. And one counter narrative they found is hell is where you belong, stupid faggot, go hang yourself. Actually, basically, it's trying to fight hate speech with another hate speech or fighting fire with fire. It's not de-escalating the conversation, it's not providing an argument, and is attacking the person and not the argument itself. Basically, it's just producing more hate and more polarization. So this is not something we aim for. Another possibility is crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing is a sourcing model that basically uses the crowd of non-skilled people that you contact them online to write things that you need. The advantage of this approach is the speed, flexibility, scalability, and cost. Crowdsourcing has been extensively used in natural language processing and in artificial intelligence, so it might see a viable solution to collect the counter-narratives. So, again, you can obtain a good amount of data at a reasonable price, but the problem is that annotators are not trained, and being trained to write proper counter-narratives requires a lot of time, requires weeks. So what you might end up with, this is the experience of these researchers, is that they obtain a very repetitive and very simple kind of counter-narrative dataset. Muslim are just a bunch of fagots. The F word is unacceptable. Please refrain from future use. Please refrain from using derogatory terms for other religions. Please don't use hateful words or else removal will take place. All the comments, basically, all the counter-narratives has this very simple form in this dataset. For this reason, we resorted to niche sourcing. Niche sourcing is basically the idea of using as a crowd experts from NGOs. Of course, niche sourcing combines the strength of crowdsourcing with those of professionals. Still, it's more difficult to set up as compared to crowdsourcing. But what you can obtain is very good quality data because annotators are trained. Still, we cannot reach the number of participants of crowdsourcing, so this is a limitation. But still, this is the kind of counter-narratives you can obtain that you can obtain with other approach. So, our women are being sexually assaulted by Muslims, they are just a bunch of rapists, and the response is the majority of sexual assault are committed by a family member, friend, or partner of the victim, and only 12% of convicted rapists are Muslim. It is not the religion, it's the individuals, whether they are Muslim or not. So, giving an argument in terms of rights, give an argument in terms of statistics, and in terms of evidence. Something that you cannot obtain with crowdsourcing. The problem, as I told you, is that even with this niche sourcing approach, we cannot obtain all the data we want. So we envisage an hybrid approach. And basically, the idea was to put together a language model, suboptimal language model, trained on the data we have, that produce new counter-narratives. And there are reviewers that filter counter-narratives and provide it to NGO operators to select those that are most suitable and that can be manually modified. The interesting thing here is that we try to reduce the time needed to collect data by putting together a neural network, an artificial intelligence, and an NGO operator. So basically, we give an input to a neural network, and then this neural network produces many speech counter-narrative pairs that are suboptimal. And what we found is that basically, and this is a result that we obtained with an experiment that involved more than 100 operators from 3 different NGOs. So the results were quite reliable and stable. If provided with no suggestion, operator will take up to 8 minutes to write, on average, to write a counter-narrative. If we use filtering or the language model plus the filtering, the time is drastically reduced, and the more stringent the filtering, the less time needed to the NGO operator to write a proper counter-narrative. This, of course, comes at the cost of less novel and more repetitive kind of counter-narratives. Still, we also envisaged a more advanced approach, which is a hybrid approach, which starts from this consideration. Look, this artificial intelligence plus reviewer plus NGO operator is very nice, but so it reduces the effort needed to collect data, but the point is, does not take advantage of the newly generated data. So our idea was simply, once we have new data manually corrected by NGO operator, we can use this data to further refine or to improve this language model, our neural network, to obtain better and new data. We used this approach to build a multi-target dataset in last year in a very effective way. So basically, We iterated this session several times. We generate some data, we provided it to a NGO operators, NGO operator corrected this data, we give it back this additional data to the neural network, we refine the neural network several times. What we say in terms of efficiency is that across iteration, the number of pairs of example that has been accepted by the operators steadily increase, and the HTER, which is the manual intervention needed to correct these pairs, steadily decrease across iteration, which is very good. The point is that the quality tended to decrease, that because across iteration, the new pairs tend to be more repetitive and less novel as compared to the previous example. For this reason, we try to modify the neural network at each iteration in order to generate data in different way. And without going into much details, what we manage is that by dynamically modifying the neural network at each iteration, we manage to obtain new and better pairs without hindering efficiency too much. So we improve the quality without basically increasing, without hindering too much efficiency. Basically, the results are that this advanced hybrid approach that puts together a neural network and a human tend to increase efficiency, but while the quality decrease, but the dynamic adaptation increase again the quality without hindering too much efficiency, as I told you. The outcome of this experiment was a new dataset of 5,000 hate-speech counter-narrative pairs, comprising different target people of color, Jewish people, Muslim, women, LGBT, and so on and so forth. To sum up, to collect data, we know that crawling, so I'm summing up what I presented you about methodologies to collect data. With crawling, the quantity of data is good, but the quality is not respected because in many cases the collected counter-narrative from the web are hateful responses themselves. Crowdsourcing still provide quantity, conformity, but the responses, the counter-narratives tend to be very, very repetitive. News sourcing provide a good quantity, but not as much as the two, but provide conformity and diversity as desired in terms of quality. Our hybrid approaches instead manage to fulfill all these desiderata in one shot. So, this is our experience on building algorithm and data to provide a suggestion with artificial intelligence on how to write proper counter-narratives. We also experimented this, as I told you, and the results were quite striking in terms of increasing the efficiency of NGO operators. Still, there are many, and with this last part, I'm going to close my presentation. There are interesting open topics. So, for example, multilinguality, we did an experiment, and basically we showed that if we translate data from one language to the other, I'm simplifying a lot in this case, just to conclude, by automatically translating data, we can drastically reduce the example needed in a new language in order to properly train a new neural network in that language. So instead of needing, for example, 2,000 examples, we might need a few hundred examples plus example translated from another language that we already have in order to obtain very good performances. Another point that I think is a partial response to one of the questions that was raised before is that, is a counter-narrative and argumentation the same things? There are, of course, many overlapping between counter-narrative and argumentation. Still, a counter-narrative is a counter-narrative, and a counter-narrative can be a counter-argument. but there are also differences between counter-narrative and argumentation. And this is the example I would like you to remember. This is an example that was generated by the neural network that we trained specifically only on argumentation, not on counter-narrative generation. And then we presented to this argumentative neural network this hate speech. And look what happens. We gave to this neural network, we should kill all the Jews. And then this purely argumentative neural network answered, but there are many alternatives to removing Jews, such as converting them to another religion, for example, Buddhism. This is the verbatim output of this neural network, which is strikingly good from an argumentative point of view. But from a, moral acceptability, from values acceptability, this is completely wrong, okay? So that's why I say we have to stick to some values in order to define counter-narratives. And this is the last example I want to leave you. And before concluding, I have to thank my colleagues that have been working with me, because many people work with me in this wonderful journey. So, for example, Sarah, who is a researcher here in my group, Yiling, who is a PhD student that just defended her PhD, and now she went to work with other people in UK on counter-narrative, and Elena, she started a PhD recently on this topic. And then we had also some internship students who worked with us, Margherita, Elisabetta, and Sarah on this topic across the years. And I want really to thank them. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Marco. That was a fascinating journey, and we see the importance and the relevance of this research, also for our own field. I really wish that the conversation will continue, because we had 3 wonderful talks, and we have a couple of minutes for questions and comments. It's almost 7. Unfortunately, I have another meeting at 7, but I would like to give the proper time for discussion also to this last paper. I mean, my comment is actually a question, and I see in a field that I know a little bit better, the production of visual fake and the checking of visual fake, that sometimes there is the fear that that leads to sort of an escalation, where there are algorithms producing fakes and counter algorithms somehow trying to check on these visual fakes. Is there the risk that this continuous involvement of algorithms will escalate in a sort of a conflict between algorithms producing hate narratives and other algorithms producing counter narratives? And if that is the case, is it going to be completely symmetric? Because I remember an interview with Ian Goodfellow, who was the inventor of generative adversarial networks, who said that in the mechanism of GANs, there is a certain imbalance, somehow privileging the production of fake over the production of fake detection. So what is your opinion about that? Is there a danger of escalation, and is there an imbalance and asymmetry in this escalation?
Well, this is a very nice question. Okay. Yes, there is an escalation, but I am not worried that much about the escalation, because somehow the point is that the generation algorithm for hate speech rely on the very same language model that we use nowadays. But since we know this language model, we can easily spot hate speech that has been automatically generated, because basically, I didn't talk about this, the distribution of word is exactly the distribution of word that will produce that language model. So, and the distribution of word of an artificial intelligence is different from the distribution of word made by a human. So it's very easy, even if the output of a machine is really human-like, from a mathematical perspective, it's 100% spottable as machine generated, okay? So we need a very few examples to understand if it is generated by a human or by a machine, okay? because basically machine tend to generate, the decoding mechanism is called, tend to generate with a very smooth distribution, while human tend to be more creative, okay? Sometimes they give a very probable word, but then they pick up a very improbable one, according to the language model. This is something that the machine is not able to do, okay? If we want to have a credible generation. So this is the first thing. Of course, there is another problem, that there is an imbalance of data, because the amount of hate speech that is produced is huge, while the amount of counter-narrative that is produced is very small. So it's very easy to collect hateful data to train an hateful neural network. It's more difficult, as I hope I have shown you, to collect data to create a counter-narrative neural network. In addition to this, and just to conclude to your question, to avoid, from an ethical perspective, to avoid that our dataset can be used to produce also hate speech, we always have responses to hate speech, but never response to counter-narratives, okay? So it's always the counter-narrative that responds to an hate speech. We never have a counter-narrative which has an hate speech as a response. First of all. Second thing, we only use very stereotypical hate speech. So those hate speech cannot really be used to train a neural network, because they are very simple. They don't have the richness that you can find in social media. And a very last thing about ethical consideration, we always use this neural network as a suggestion tool, because we believe we cannot create bot for generating counter-narrative in a completely automated way. It would be unethical from our perspective, so they are only meant as a suggestion tool for humans. It's always up to the human, it's a human companion. It's always up to the human, it's a clip that suggests counter-narrative. It's always up to the human to decide what to write and what to post on social media. The final decision is always up to the human.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a very, very clear answer and very informative. So unfortunately, we have to close. I will have so many more questions and comments, but I hope that the conversation will go on. And I thank in particular Stefanie ULLMANN for her presentation and for being with us until the end, and Marco Guerini and all the participants and for the other ones. So we'll continue with this multidisciplinary reflection on polarization and depolarization, also religion and ethics. Thank you very much. Have a very good one. A very good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.